The Middle East of today is littered with war, civil unrest, broken promises and never-ending violence. But how did it get this way? Many people point to World War I as being the catalyst for endless conflicts in the Middle East. And by the end of this video, you'll know whether or not that's true. To understand how we got here, we need to understand what the Middle East was like before World War I. Before World War I, most of the Middle East was ruled by the Ottoman Empire, which controlled vast territories, including modern-day Turkey, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Jordan, and the Western Arabian Peninsula. While the Ottomans directly governed some areas, others, like the Hijaz, home to Mecca and Medina, enjoyed relative autonomy. However, by the early 20th century, Arab nationalist sentiment was growing, fueled by resentment toward Ottoman rule. Meanwhile, the British Empire maintained control over Egypt, which had technically remained an Ottoman province but had been under British occupation since 1882. Britain also controlled strategic territories along the Persian Gulf, including Aden in modern Yemen, and several small protectorates like Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, and the Trucial States, now the United Arab Emirates. To the east, Persia, modern Iran, was an independent kingdom, though heavily influenced by both British and Russian imperial interests. But when World War I broke out, everything changed. The Ottoman Empire joined the Central Powers, setting off a chain of events that would reshape the Middle East forever. In 1914, the Ottoman Empire sided with the Central Powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary, bringing much of the Middle East into the global conflict. The British, seeking to undermine Ottoman control, backed local uprisings, most notably the Arab Revolt, 1916 to 1918, led by Sharif Hussein of Mecca, with assistance from T.E. Lawrence, known famously as Lawrence of Arabia. Meanwhile, British and French forces launched direct military campaigns to seize Ottoman territories. British troops captured Iraq, Palestine and Jordan, while the French targeted Lebanon and Syria. By the end of the war in 1918, the Ottoman Empire collapsed, leaving the victorious Allies, primarily Britain and France, to carve up the region. While Britain was making secret deals with other European powers, it was making promises to the Arabs, the betrayal of which would shape the future of the Middle East in ways no one expected. Did these decisions fundamentally reshape the Middle East and plant the seeds for the conflicts that followed? Before we dive into that, though, I need you to hit the subscribe button if you love learning about history. The post-war division of the Middle East was dictated by imperial interests rather than local identities. The Sykes-Picot Agreement, 1916, a secret deal between Britain and France, divided the former Ottoman lands into spheres of influence, formalized in the League of Nations mandates after the war. Britain took control of Iraq, Palestine and Transjordan, modern Jordan, placing King Faisal I on the throne of Iraq in 1921 and appointing Emir Abdullah as the ruler of Transjordan. Palestine became a separate British mandate, setting the stage for future conflict between Arabs and Jewish settlers. Meanwhile, France controlled Syria and Lebanon, enforcing direct rule and crushing local revolts, including the Great Syrian Revolt of 1925. In Arabia, the Hashemite kingdom of the Hijaz briefly emerged as an independent state before being conquered in 1925 by Ibn Saud, who unified the region into Saudi Arabia in 1932. One of the most profound consequences was the creation of artificial borders that ignored tribal, religious, and ethnic realities. The newly created states of Iraq, Syria, Lebanon and Jordan were drawn largely based on British and French negotiations rather than local demographics. This led to sectarian divisions and internal instability that persist to this day. Iraq, for instance, combined Sunni Arabs, Shia Arabs and Kurds into one state, laying the groundwork for decades of tension, rebellion and eventual war. Similarly, Syria's multi-ethnic composition led to cycles of unrest, coups, and later civil war. The imposition of foreign rule intensified nationalist and anti-colonial movements, particularly in Iraq, Syria, and Palestine. Britain's rule over Iraq faced an armed uprising in 1920, which required military intervention. Similarly, France's harsh policies in Syria led to an armed rebellion in 1925. These early revolts set a precedent for continued resistance against colonial powers and later anti-Western sentiment across the region. By the mid-20th century, these nationalist movements would overthrow British-backed monarchies in Egypt, 1952, and Iraq, 1958, and inspire pan-Arabism under leaders like Egypt's Gamal Abdel Nasser. While the betrayal Sykes-Picot wrought on the Arabs set the stage for future conflict, Britain made yet another promise, one that would inflame even more tension in the region. One of the most enduring and deeply consequential effects of World War I was the Zionist-Arab conflict in Palestine, a geopolitical struggle that continues to shape the Middle East today. At the heart of this conflict was Britain's duplicity, which saw it make irreconcilable promises to both Arab nationalists and Zionist leaders. In 1917, Britain issued the Balfour Declaration, formally expressing support for the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine, while at the same time it had promised Arab independence through wartime negotiations with Sharif Hussein of Mecca. This contradiction fueled Arab resistance to Jewish immigration, escalating tensions and igniting revolts, such as the Arab Revolt of 1936 to 1939, which marked the beginning of a protracted struggle that would ultimately result in the Arab-Israeli conflict. From violent clashes to full-scale wars, the consequences of these contradictory commitments continue to reverberate, defining the political landscape of the region. The post-war transformation of the Middle East created an environment ripe for major power struggles among both regional and global players. The fall of the Ottoman Empire and the subsequent reshuffling of territories empowered new political entities. In Arabia, Ibn Saud successfully established a conservative Islamic monarchy, which would later contend for influence with secular Arab nationalist movements in Egypt, Iraq, and Syria. Meanwhile, Iran, under the Pahlavi dynasty, pursued a modernizing agenda with support from Britain and the United States, fueling long-term tensions with its Arab neighbors. Oil, an emerging source of immense political and economic power, further complicated these struggles. The vast reserves of the Middle East were largely developed under Western control, transforming the region into both a geopolitical battleground and a critical economic asset for foreign powers. Disputes over oil revenues, the presence of Western corporations, and subsequent foreign interventions only deepened regional instability, ensuring that the Middle East remained entangled in both internal conflicts and broader global struggles. The end of World War I also set a precedent for direct foreign intervention and military occupation that would persist well into the 20th and 21st centuries. Britain and France, under the guise of League of Nations mandates, exerted control over large portions of the Middle East, carving up former Ottoman territories with little regard for the people who lived there. Resistance to colonial rule erupted almost immediately, with violent uprisings in Iraq, Syria, and Palestine. Yet, even after gaining formal independence, many Middle Eastern states remained deeply entangled with Western powers. Britain and France continued to wield influence, often resorting to military action to maintain control, while the United States emerged as a dominant force in the region after World War II. The resentment toward this perpetual interference gave rise to a spectrum of ideological movements, from Arab socialism to radical Islamist militancy. The impact of these dynamics can be seen in conflicts ranging from the Iranian Revolution of 1979 to the Gulf Wars and the ongoing instability in Iraq and Syria, all of which have roots in the region's post-war restructuring. Before the war, Palestine was an Ottoman province, inhabited primarily by an Arab Muslim majority, alongside smaller Christian and Jewish communities. While Jewish migration to Palestine had begun in the late 19th century as part of the Zionist movement, it remained relatively small, with most settlers arriving from Russia and Eastern Europe to escape persecution. By 1914, approximately 90,000 Jews lived in Palestine, dwarfed by a Palestinian Arab population of over 500,000. The Ottoman authorities, wary of growing Zionist land purchases, implemented restrictions on Jewish immigration, though many Jewish settlers found ways to bypass these limitations. Despite these tensions, the region remained relatively stable under Ottoman rule. However, Britain's wartime strategies would soon unravel this fragile equilibrium. During World War I, Britain sought Arab support in its fight against the Ottoman Empire, which had allied with Germany. In a series of secret correspondences between 1915 and 1916, British officials negotiated with Sharif Hussein of Mecca, promising him control over an independent Arab kingdom in exchange for his leadership of the Arab revolt against the Ottomans. The Arab forces, led by Hussein's sons and supported by British officer T.E. Lawrence, played a key role in dismantling Ottoman control in the region, believing they were fighting for self-rule. However, unbeknownst to them, Britain had simultaneously entered into another agreement, one that directly contradicted its promises to the Arabs. In 1917, British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour issued a letter, now infamously known as the Balfour Declaration, announcing Britain's support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. The declaration, which had been heavily lobbied for by Zionist leaders like Chaim Weizmann, was designed to secure Jewish political support for the war effort. However, it came with a vague and contradictory clause, stating that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. Given that Palestinian Arabs made up more than 90% of the population at the time, this statement did little to address their political aspirations or concerns. Instead, it set the stage for a looming crisis, as both Jews and Arabs now expected exclusive control over Palestine. Following the war, Britain took formal control of Palestine under the League of Nations mandate system, tasked with overseeing its transition to self-governance. However, Britain's role quickly devolved into a balancing act between competing Zionist and Arab demands. Jewish immigration surged as Zionist organizations encouraged migration, purchasing land and building autonomous communities. Palestinian Arabs, who had anticipated an independent Arab state, saw these developments as a direct threat to their homeland and future sovereignty. Between 1920 and 1939, the Jewish population quadrupled, rising to over 400,000. This demographic shift, combined with Zionist land acquisitions that often displaced Arab tenant farmers, sparked widespread resistance. By the late 1920s, sporadic riots and clashes between Jewish settlers and Palestinian Arabs escalated into full-scale confrontations. The 1929 riots, triggered by disputes over Jewish worship rights at the Western Wall in Jerusalem, saw massacres of Jews in Hebron and violent retaliations against Arabs. These incidents cemented the growing hostility between the two communities and demonstrated Britain's inability to maintain control. With tensions mounting, the situation boiled over into outright rebellion. In 1936, Palestinian Arabs launched a full-scale revolt against both British rule and Jewish immigration. The Arab revolt lasted 3 years, marked by strikes, sabotage, and armed insurgency. British forces, already struggling to maintain order, responded with brutal countermeasures, including mass arrests, home demolitions, and aerial bombings of Arab villages. Zionist militias, particularly the Haganah, began organizing paramilitary defense forces, which would later evolve into the Israeli Defense Forces, IDF. By 1939, Britain had suppressed the revolt, but the damage was done. Palestine was now in a state of irreconcilable division. As World War II began, the stakes grew even higher. The Holocaust radically reshaped global attitudes toward Jewish statehood, as 6 million Jews were exterminated in Nazi concentration camps. Jewish efforts to migrate to Palestine increased exponentially, but Britain, hoping to appease Arab opposition, issued the White Paper of 1939, severely restricting Jewish immigration. This enraged Zionist leaders, who now viewed Britain as an obstacle to their national aspirations. Jewish militias, including the Irgun and Lehi, known as the Stern Gang, shifted their focus toward expelling the British, launching a campaign of bombings and assassinations. The most infamous attack came in 1946, when Irgun bombed the King David Hotel, killing 91 people. By 1947, Britain had lost control and handed the Palestine issue over to the United Nations. The UN proposed a partition plan, dividing the land into separate Jewish and Arab states, with Jerusalem under international administration. Jewish leaders accepted the plan, but Arab leaders rejected it, believing it unjustly favored the Zionist movement. On May 14, 1948, David Ben-Gurion declared the establishment of Israel. Within hours, 5 Arab nations, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon, invaded, aiming to annihilate the new state. Instead, Israel emerged victorious, expanding its territory beyond the UN partition lines. The war created a massive refugee crisis, as 750,000 Palestinian Arabs were expelled or fled their homes. Decades later, their descendants remain stateless, scattered across refugee camps and disputed territories. The Israel-Palestine conflict remains one of the most intractable disputes in modern history, rooted in imperial betrayals, demographic shifts, and competing national identities. Over a century after the Balfour Declaration, the battle for Palestine is far from over. The Israel-Palestine conflict has roots that extend far beyond the post-World War I division of the Middle East. While the British Mandate and the Balfour Declaration played a crucial role in shaping the modern dispute, the deeper historical, ideological, and geopolitical factors that contributed to the conflict began much earlier. Jewish and Arab communities coexisted in Palestine for centuries under various rulers, including the Ottomans. But the late 19th century saw a dramatic shift due to the rise of both Zionism and Arab nationalism. The Zionist movement, propelled by rising anti-Semitism in Europe and a desire to establish a Jewish homeland, began large-scale immigration and land purchases in Ottoman Palestine. At the same time, Arab nationalism was intensifying in opposition to both European colonialism and the increasing Jewish presence, leading to tensions over land, identity, and sovereignty. A defining moment came with the Holocaust and World War II, which dramatically increased global support for Zionism. With 6 million Jews murdered by the Nazis, the urgency of establishing a Jewish state became a moral imperative for many in the international community. British immigration restrictions in Palestine, imposed to appease Arab opposition, led to direct confrontations between Jewish militias and British forces, culminating in bombings and attacks aimed at forcing Britain out. The Cold War further shaped the trajectory of the conflict, as Israel aligned with the United States, while the Soviet Union backed Arab states and Palestinian militant groups. The 1967 Six-Day War, in which Israel captured the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem, escalated tensions even further. The Palestinian struggle transformed into one of armed resistance, with groups like the PLO launching guerrilla attacks and later Hamas engaging in insurgency tactics. Israel's continued expansion of settlements in the occupied territories, coupled with Palestinian uprisings, created an ongoing cycle of violence. The 2023 Hamas attack on Israel and the subsequent Gaza war are merely the latest flare-ups in a conflict that has evolved over a century but remains unresolved. The rise of the Islamic State, ISIS, in the early 21st century is deeply rooted in the aftermath of World War I, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, and the subsequent reshaping of the Middle East by European powers. The borders, governance structures and ethnic tensions that fueled the emergence of ISIS can be traced back to the imperial policies of Britain and France after the war. The arbitrary partitioning of the region, the suppression of local governance, and the marginalization of key ethnic and religious groups created long-term instability that ISIS later exploited. While ISIS is a modern phenomenon, its ideological and geopolitical roots extend back to the decisions made in the early 20th century. One of the most enduring consequences of World War I in the Middle East was the Sykes-Picot Agreement and the arbitrary borders it created. These newly created borders ignored ethnic, tribal and sectarian realities, forcing Sunni and Shia Muslims, Kurds and other minorities into states with little historical precedent. This lack of consideration for local identities led to deep-seated resentment on which ISIS later capitalized. In 2014, ISIS fighters symbolically bulldozed the Iraq-Syria border, declaring the end of Sykes-Picot as part of their effort to erase colonial legacies and establish a caliphate. The creation of Iraq in 1920 was another major consequence of World War I. Before the war, Iraq was not a unified country, but rather three Ottoman provinces, Mosul, Baghdad and Basra, each with distinct ethnic and sectarian populations. Sunni Arabs had traditionally dominated Iraq under Ottoman rule, despite being a minority. The Shia Arab majority resented this imbalance, while the Kurdish population in the north had its own nationalist aspirations. When the British installed a Sunni monarchy under King Faisal, they reinforced these sectarian divisions by excluding Shia and Kurdish communities from political power. These tensions simmered for decades, leading to uprisings, civil unrest, and the eventual emergence of ISIS as a militant force in post-Saddam Iraq. Before World War I, the Ottoman Sultan held the title of Caliph, serving as a symbolic leader for the global Muslim community. When the Ottoman Empire collapsed, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk formally abolished the caliphate in 1924, a move that many Islamist movements viewed as a catastrophe. Since then, various groups have sought to restore the caliphate as both a political and religious institution. ISIS claimed to fulfill this ambition in 2014 when its leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, declared himself caliph of the so-called Islamic State. The group's ideology was rooted in a rejection of the post-Ottoman political order, portraying itself as the true successor to Islamic governance before the colonial period. The imperial rule that followed World War I fostered deep resentment against Western powers, particularly in Iraq and Syria, where the French and British imposed control with little regard for local governance. The British violently suppressed Iraqi revolts in the 1920s, while the French crushed uprisings in Syria, fueling a legacy of foreign interference that persisted into the modern era. This pattern of external intervention continued throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, with US and British military operations reinforcing narratives of Western occupation. ISIS exploited these grievances in its propaganda, positioning itself as a defender against imperialist aggression and mobilizing recruits by framing its war as a continuation of the struggle against colonial rule. Though World War I set the long-term foundation for instability, the 2003 US invasion of Iraq was the immediate catalyst for ISIS's rise. The US overthrew Saddam Hussein, dismantled the Sunni-dominated Ba'athist military, and empowered Iraq's Shia majority. This sudden shift alienated many Sunni Iraqis, some of whom later joined ISIS as an anti-Shia and anti-Western force. Former Ba'athist officers, trained under Saddam, became key military strategists for ISIS, making the group far more effective than previous jihadist organizations. The chaos of the Syrian civil war further provided ISIS with an opportunity to seize large territories, establishing a self-declared caliphate that briefly controlled large parts of Iraq and Syria. While Iran supports Palestinian militants in Israel, it fought ISIS aggressively in Iraq and Syria. Iran's role in the fight against ISIS is part of a broader Shia-Sunni struggle that also has roots in the post-World War I redrawing of the Middle East. The Sykes-Picot Agreement placed Iraq under British control, where Britain installed a Sunni monarchy over a Shia majority population. This created a long-standing sectarian divide, and Iran, as the center of global Shiism, saw Iraq's Shia as natural allies. When Saddam Hussein ruled Iraq from 1979 to 2003, he fought Iran in the brutal Iran-Iraq War, reinforcing hostilities. But after the US invasion of Iraq in 2003, Iran moved quickly to fill the power vacuum, supporting Shia militias that would later play a decisive role in defeating ISIS. When the US removed Saddam, Iran seized the opportunity to exert influence over Iraq's new government, which was now Shia-led under Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki. However, Maliki's sectarian policies alienated Sunnis, fueling the insurgency that became ISIS. Iran provided weapons and training to Shia militias such as Kataib Hezbollah and the Badr organization to fight ISIS in Iraq. The Quds Force, led by General Qasem Soleimani, coordinated Iraqi, Iranian and Syrian forces against ISIS, ensuring that Iran played a central role in the group's defeat. However, Iran's growing influence deepened sectarian tensions, as many Sunni Iraqis viewed Iranian-backed militias as oppressive occupiers. Iran's involvement in both the Israel-Palestine conflict and the fight against ISIS is deeply tied to the post-World War I order that shaped the modern Middle East. The artificial borders, sectarian divisions, and imperialist betrayals of the early 20th century set the stage for Iran's dual role as both a revolutionary power opposing Israel and a Shia hegemon battling Sunni jihadism. Iran sees itself as the vanguard of anti-Zionism and anti-imperialism, shaping its support for Palestinian resistance, while also using its influence to counter Sunni extremism. The Hamas attack on Israel in 2023 and the subsequent Gaza war are not just about Israeli-Palestinian tensions, they also reflect Iran's broader struggle for influence in the Middle East. While Iran was not directly responsible for the attack, its long-standing support for Hamas and other Palestinian militant groups fits within its wider strategy to challenge Israel and Western powers. At the same time, Iran's influence in Iraq and Syria, where it helped defeat ISIS, has made it a key power broker in the region. Whether through funding Palestinian militias, battling ISIS, or challenging Western dominance, Iran's actions today are deeply rooted in the imperialist decisions made a century ago. The instability caused by colonial-era decisions continues to shape the region, ensuring that the conflicts ignited by World War I remain unresolved more than a century later. While the post-World War I reordering of the Middle East contributed to the instability that ISIS later exploited, the roots of the group stretch far beyond the imperialist decisions of the early 20th century. ISIS is fundamentally a product of modern jihadist ideology, which developed over decades in response to colonialism, secular Arab nationalism, and Western military interventions. The origins of Salafi jihadism, the ideology that fuels ISIS, can be traced back to the 18th century Wahhabi movement in Arabia, which sought a return to an ultra-puritanical interpretation of Islam. Later, 20th century thinkers like Sayyid Qutb promoted the idea that Muslim societies had strayed from true Islam and that violent jihad was necessary to overthrow secular and Western-backed regimes. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 was another key moment in the rise of jihadist movements. The United States, Saudi Arabia and Pakistan funded and armed Afghan fighters, many of whom later formed the nucleus of al-Qaeda. This war provided invaluable combat experience and established a transnational jihadist network that would later give rise to ISIS. The US invasion of Iraq in 2003 provided the immediate conditions for ISIS's rise. The chaos of the Syrian civil war, which began in 2011, provided ISIS with an opportunity to seize large territories. Unlike Al-Qaeda, which focused on terrorism, ISIS sought to create a functioning state. In 2014, it declared a caliphate, controlling vast swaths of Iraq and Syria. The group's brutal governance, sophisticated propaganda, and ability to recruit thousands of foreign fighters made it one of the most dangerous jihadist movements in modern history. However, ISIS's extreme violence and territorial ambitions led to an international military response, with the US, Russia, Iran, and various militias working to destroy the so-called caliphate. By 2019, ISIS had lost almost all its territory, but its ideology and network continued to inspire attacks worldwide. While the legacy of World War I set the stage for many of the Middle East's modern conflicts, the Israel-Palestine dispute and the rise of ISIS have deeper historical roots. The Holocaust, the Cold War, and the failures of post-colonial governance were just as instrumental in shaping the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as the British Mandate. Similarly, the emergence of ISIS cannot be solely blamed on the Sykes-Picot Agreement. The ideology that fuels jihadist movements has evolved over centuries, shaped by modern wars, regional rivalries, and Western interventions. Iran's role in both conflicts further highlights how present-day power struggles are not merely the products of European imperialism, but also the result of internal Middle Eastern dynamics. Whether through support for Palestinian militants or fighting against ISIS, Iran's actions reflect a long history of sectarian, ideological, and geopolitical competition that continues to shape the region today. So with all of these different factors at play, one big question remains: was World War I truly to blame? The modern Middle East is a product of multiple overlapping histories, some shaped by the decisions made after World War I, others by ideological and geopolitical struggles that have unfolded over centuries. The Israel-Palestine conflict continues to be driven by competing nationalisms, religious tensions, and territorial disputes, while the rise of ISIS is rooted in a broader history of jihadism, sectarian grievances, and military interventions. Iran, as a key regional actor, plays a dual role in both conflicts, supporting Palestinian militancy while simultaneously fighting Sunni jihadist groups. As new wars and uprisings emerge, from the Hamas-Israel war in 2023 to ongoing insurgencies in Iraq and Syria, it is clear that the forces shaping the Middle East today are not just the echoes of colonial-era decisions, but the result of evolving political, religious, and military struggles. Understanding these deeper layers is essential to grasping why these conflicts persist and why they will continue to shape global politics for years to come. If you liked this video, you're going to love this one about how a small OSS unit took down 10,000 Japanese troops in Burma.